This series, Praxis of Care, is dedicated to Andrew Levitt, who taught at Waterloo for 3 decades and passed away 1 year ago. He taught with care and about care, providing students with tools to cultivate well-being and to practice architecture in a more caring way. So this lecture series asks, what is an architecture of care? Over 4 terms, from fall 2021 to winter 2023, a series of conversations have brought together architects, designers, researchers, artists, activists, and care workers to discuss care through themes of attention, action, communication, and maintenance. This semester, as I already said, we are investigating the theme of maintenance. And tonight, we will home in on the theme of cultural districts. I'd like to thank our planning committee. It's myself, Adrian Blackwell, Jalia Fonseca, Mary Paul McDonald, Beth Vince, Wendy Wan, Joel Wan, and Victor Zagabe. And also I'd like to thank Mary Paranthahan and Brenda Reed, former members. Thank you as well to Julia Nakanishi for designing the poster, and of course to Ariscraft Canadian Brick for funding this lecture series. I will now introduce our moderator for the series on maintenance, Linda Zhang. Linda Zhang is an assistant professor here at the School of Architecture. Linda is a registered architect, an interior designer, a drone pilot, and co-founding principal at Studio Pararaum in Toronto and Zurich. Previously, Linda was the 2022 Artist in Residence at the European Ceramic Work Centre, the 2022 Toronto Metropolitan University Library Research in Residence, and the 2021-2022 Visiting Scholar at NYU's APA Institute. The 2019 Multicultural Fellow at NCECA, 2017 and 2018 Bogosian Fellowship at Syracuse University SOA, as well as the 2017 Fellowship at the Berlin Center for Art and Urbanistics. Prior to joining Waterloo Architecture, Linda Zhang was an assistant professor at Toronto Metropolitan University and Syracuse University, where she received the 2022 TMU Social Innovation in Action SRC Award, the 2020 Toronto Excellence Award, and the 2021 TMU Provost's Award for Teaching Excellence, and the 2021 TMU Dean Scholarly Research and Creative Activity Award. So we are very lucky to have Linda here with us tonight. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you so much. It's always really awkward hearing your bio. So now I'm going to make you both feel really welcomed and awkward. Great. I'm so excited to be moderating this discussion today, and very excited to kind of unpack the complexity of cultural districts with both of you. So I'll introduce our first speaker today. That is Tura Wilson. So Tura is a co-founder and principal of Studio of Contemporary Architecture. He is a licensed architect in Ontario and the Netherlands, and a founding member of the Black Architects and Interior Designers Association. Tura's interest and experience spans a variety of scales and building types. I'm guessing I'm too short is what you're walking up for. All right. Height adjustments. All right. So Tura's interests and experience spans a variety of scales and building types, including housing, cultural spaces, and urban design. He holds an undergraduate degree in architecture from Toronto Metropolitan University and a master's degree in architecture from Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. Some of you may also recognize him from, he was also teaching here last term as well. So excited to hear what you have to say about cultural districts and maintenance and care, which I think are terms that can be interpreted in widely different and sometimes polar opposite ways. So I'm excited to have this conversation this evening. So welcome.
Some familiar faces. Thanks for having me. Happy for the full house tonight. When I was told I was told in the frame of maintenance, not necessarily for cultural districts, but culture in general. So we'll be speaking about architecture and maintenance and my practice and some of the stuff that I do outside my practice, as you mentioned, with Beta. Starting off with my practice, Studio of Contemporary Architecture, or SOCA for short. This is myself and studio partner Shane in the yellow shirt, just on our studio roof in Toronto in the east end of the city. And we founded the practice and gave it the name for the thinking that we wanted to be a studio that dealt with culture, that dealt with contemporary issues within architecture. It was a very generic and basic name, and a lot of our work spans from private residential to institutional, sports and rec, and a lot of community organizations within the city of Toronto. Speaking to the theme given maintenance, I think the very dictionary definition is telling to a lot of the work that we do and how we approach a lot of our projects, especially in the communities that we work within, to maintain, to keep, cut the screen here, to keep in an existing state as a repair, efficiency, validity, preserve from failure or decline, from more maybe military perspective, to sustain against opposition or danger, uphold and defend, to support or provide for. And I think some of these basic dictionary definitions kind of get to some of the core of our work. One of our first projects, a residential project, was my own home, and I might have presented this to some of you before at a lecture here. This was formerly my grandmother's house, and I think it can get to a lot of ideas of, for us, interest. How do we reinterpret ideas in architecture? And this was my grandmother's house, and how to reinterpret her legacy in a home, but also thinking about the future generations. This is actually my wife and I getting married on the porch, and it was rebuilt the front porch based on archival photos at the Toronto Archives. And it was, looking at the porch as a place of celebration for both the community and neighborhood. And, we've used the porch for street parties, for holding a stage for bands, and painted in my grandmother's favorite color, yellow, as a nod to her Jamaican roots. And she'd always painted every room in the house yellow. And it's just a bit of a nod to her. And I think that, to say, part of maintenance, this is the interior. It's not always, it's I think evolving from what's there. So it's not necessarily supporting fully, or preservation is an interest, but it's, building and interpreting ideas of the house. And one concept of the house was, it was in really rough shape. It was mold, asbestos, raccoons living in the roof. And it was, reinterpreting her legacy. And it was a tough kind of to figure out what would be kept, especially when it was in such rough shape. And it was, in a way, letting go. And I was looking at cutting a hole, which you can see in the photo on to the left, which was her former bedroom. There's a void in the space to kind of evoke her memory. And working with an artist, a really amazing artist, Rajni Pereira, who has an exhibit right now at the McMichael. She's doing amazing stuff. You should check her out. She painted this portrait of my grandmother, which you can't really see from the photo here, but acts as a stained glass. It's hanging in front of a window, so it's on mylar. So it changes color throughout the day, depending on the sun. And I think a lot of our, residential work, especially in Toronto, is, building. It's, this was a Victorian house, a gut reno. It's, building from what's there and trying to find meaning or the sort of core identities, and reinterpreting that. Another project I'll touch on, and we were hired, you might be familiar, for those of you, of Band Gallery in Toronto. This is in Parkdale. If you're familiar with that area, so the west end of the city, just north of Queen on Brock Street. And we were hired for schematic design, working with them to develop an expansion of their gallery. And they came to us, asking for an expanded gallery for identity and accessibility and more space. One of the things we really looked at is, especially as a Black gallery, I should have started saying it's a Black gallery for emerging Black artists in the city of Toronto. So it's, artists who are not yet established. And it was founded by Karen Carter among a few other women. And, one question for us was, I think, the meaning of a Black space, particularly a Black cultural space in a Victorian era home. And the narrative we wanted to take, and it from both a functional perspective and also a legacy perspective of, the entrance historically for Black people, whether if it's, the back of house at a movie cinema, or, the maids or servants' quarters at the back, was to sort of flip that on its head and to celebrate the back entry as opposed to being discarded, or the front is typically celebrated. And it worked quite well functionally too. So it was flipping the gallery from the main entrance from the front of the Victorian home to the side and the back, which would then act as a new elevator core, staircase, and rear gallery. And I know I only have, I think it's 20 minutes, so I'll fly through some of these slides rather quickly. Again, so the back is a celebration to the exterior for outdoor and indoor events that they hold, where then the front gallery is maintaining the more traditional Victorian era home, but widening it so you get the full width of the house for a gallery at the front, which split into 2 galleries in a section. Another project that we were working on is for a group called It's Okay Studios, based in Toronto, founded by Saeed and Chris Wilson. I'm forgetting Saeed's last name, but cool dudes who have been throwing events in the city in various locations, and it's gradually become more structured, where they partnered with the city of Toronto, who purchased this building. And so they have a short-term lease where they'll be leasing it out while the property gets redeveloped into a park. And hopefully successful, it will last. And what they do is they hold events and parties. And I think to say, we help them less from a design perspective that, or an aesthetics perspective that, an architect might typically take on. And it's to really help them through the permitting process. Just from an event perspective of managing events and throwing events and parties, they knew what to do. It was, help getting municipal approvals. It's been quite successful. So they've held music performances there. They've held workshops, talks, and ongoing. And hopefully it's something that continues in the city, especially in post-COVID area where we've seen a loss of not architectural venues, but a loss of music venues in the city. Outside of SOCA, I am a founding member of BETA, which is an acronym for Black Architects and Interior Designers Association in Canada. And it was started as a networking group of fellow Black architects wanting to get together and not really knowing an idea of where it would go, but it was just a networking group, and it's evolved into a fully fledged nonprofit with 4 pillars of work, one being advocacy, another being mentorship, the third being networking, and the fourth being outreach. So advocacy, similar to other groups like BEAT you might have heard of, is, advocating for equity, particularly within Black identifying architects or students within the profession. Mentorship, so mentoring, each other, whether that's, other practitioners, practicing architects, or students in architecture, or high school students looking to get into architecture, looking to pursue a career in architecture. Networking is, simply, I would refer to it as having fun, getting together, nights out, going for drinks. And then outreach is, using the platform to reach out to other groups within the profession. Some of our leaders, including myself, and an example of a networking event and just a fun event. This was with Francis Curie when he was at the IDS. It's not always Pritzker Prize winning architects that we meet with. It's a variety, including ourselves. As well as, youth summer camps, working with whether it's high school students or elementary school students and helping them understand what a career in architecture might mean. This project, I'll go, this was a speculative project, which is turned into a competition proposal. And it was questioning our approach to, how we treat modernist and brutalist architecture in the city. There were current plans to demolish the structure and rebuild it, and we did a speculative proposal, which was an article in the Globe and Mail, that questioned the approach of whether you have to purge the past for a cultural institution such as the St. Lawrence Centre of the Arts, which in downtown Toronto, if you're familiar, right on Front Street, to rebrand and rethink, reimagine itself. And it was, again, looking at this idea, and I think you could sort of theme that in the theme of sort of maintenance and support of, architecture, not sort of obliterating what came before it, which gets into, I think, a larger interest in the studio around modernist architecture. And I had written an article in Azure, and I presented this before, I think, to some of the students in our last studio. Those of you who might be familiar with Alexander Park in the city of Toronto, right downtown, south of Kensington Market and just west of Chinatown. It's an 18-acre modernist social housing project developed in the late 1960s. I would say the most similar project would be Regent Park, developed a little earlier than that, if you're familiar with Regent Park. And it demolished much of the existing fabric, which was not the intent of Jerome Markson, the lead architect on the project at first, and created a series of meandering streets separate from the city. And more recently, construction started in 2014 to redevelop the project. And the essay I wrote in Azure was, questioning our approach to social housing. In large part, it was already happening, but to say, Alexander Park, like many modernist social housing sites across the country, there's quite a lot of them. So is to say, is this approach, tabula rasa approach, where you sort of wipe clean everything that was once there to start a clean slate, is that the most culturally enhancing or even environmentally sustainable approach, where it's not necessarily even the architecture that's being demolished, it's mature trees that will take 2 generations to grow? And questioning, is landfilling an 18-acre community the best approach? And in large part, it comes from a fact of neglect. I think architecture sometimes takes a heavy beating from a lot of social ills and neglect from all levels of government. And you can see that with Alexander Park. It's gone through sort of a series of demolition, a series of neglect from various levels of government. And in these images show the one on the left is former Mayor Art Eggleton knocking down a wall, which was, seen as, helping to reduce crime as a wall that was a barrier to the city. And even the former mayor in 1956, Mayor Phillip, creating the first social housing development on the site. And just to jump through, so it was, part of it was a critique, and then part of it was, what would I do if, had that opportunity? We were asking ourselves at our studio, how could we keep a lot of the structures, understanding that there were a lot of issues, I think with a lot of modernist architecture, undefined zones of what's private, what's public, and who owns what. Was also seeing it as, what values, and I think there's a lot of things, especially progressive urbanists might say, car light streets or car-free streets, mature trees, quiet pedestrian streets, bike lanes are things that I think a lot of people advocate for. So it was, why tear that down? And the image on the left there was showing in purple, the buildings that we'd be keeping, acknowledging that some would have to come down, with the new buildings on the right. And it was, in a way, challenging our approach to density in the city, where, typically on neighborhoods, we don't build tall towers. In this, it was, adding the density on what was formerly surface parking, and giving identity to some of the park space. Again, I'll quickly jump through this, just given the time. An overview. Another project I'd like to speak about in Toronto's Little Jamaica. If those of you familiar, it's on Eglinton West, just west of the Allen Road, between Dufferin and the Allen Road. And this is a report started in late 2019 and early 2020. It was completed just before the pandemic broke out in 2020. And we started a report led by Black Urbanism Toronto, Budo. And it was a report on a Black business conversation. It was about planning the future of, as it says, Black businesses, acknowledging that there were a lot of issues, and there were three key issues. One was general gentrification that had been going along in Little Jamaica for quite some time, and seeing a lot of displacement of businesses and the Black population there. Second was gentrification exacerbated by the new Metrolinx LRT line, which had created, it'd gone on for over a decade, still going on today. And basic things like it had traffic. So a lot of businesses rely on foot traffic. With construction, there was a loss in foot traffic. And then the triple whammy was COVID-19. And great thing with Budo is what they did, I think, different than a lot of, other approaches, was community engagement drove the exercise. So they, rather than holding an event, they went door to door to businesses to talk to owners and residents to get their opinions on how the neighborhood had been changing. And I think this was a really key in, I think, the idea of maintenance, that it's not just architects like myself, it's people like Budo who are really advocates, and they were doing this out of volunteer base. They weren't being paid when they started this, and really out of a love of their community. And later it developed into a community engagement, and we held 2 sessions at a local restaurant, speaking to members, understanding what their issues were. And the image to the right is a part of a report we did, was just analyzing how the neighborhood had changed over the years. And it's so over a decade. So this is from the top is 2010, and then the figure ground diagram at the bottom is from early 2020, and it was mapping the loss of Caribbean and Black-owned businesses over that 10-year period during the LRT line construction. And it was additional mapping on, the fabric that sort of brought about the qualities and the character that we thought that strengthened the Little Jamaica community. In addition, it was a critique of our approach to zoning, where in Toronto, the approach for some time now has been adding density along avenues, such as, in this case, Eglinton West, where the neighborhoods beyond, and you can see in the top right diagram here, the neighborhoods beyond remain the same. So you don't touch the single family zoned houses, but you do replace the retail, commercial, mixed use main streets. And we questioned in this approach as, whether this approach was the best approach for maintaining, cultural vibrancy as well as density, considering that most of the shops and businesses along Eglinton West were in those areas that were zoned for redevelopment. And it was, to question, are there other approaches to density? And the report ended with a speculative image of what is possible, and it was to help enable the community and further work to go on to dream of what's needed, whether it's bike lanes, community resources, murals. What is beautification without gentrification or displacement, and how can a community grow while still maintaining its cultural identity? And this image was meant to speculate further questions and further engagement for Budo and others in the neighborhood, as well as residents. And then just to say, and I think a key thing with maintenance is, as it suggests, it's ongoing. You constantly need to be maintaining, and there's been further work, and there continues to be work, and Cheryl will be, I'm sure, talking about some of that. This image here was a walking tour that I led with Shane Laptis and Jay Pitter, a placemaker based in Toronto, who's doing work on a cultural master plan for the Little Jamaica neighborhood, which will be coming out soon. And Cheryl, myself, along with Budo, and Keel Eglinton Residents Association are part of contributing architects in the 2023. So this year's Venice Biennale submission. We're developing some of those ideas further, more specifically to exploring alternatives to density in culturally distinct neighborhoods, and developing spaces beyond just main streets and retail. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tura. I already have lots of questions for you, but I'm going to save that for our conversation at the end. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker. Cheryl Case founded CP Planning in 2017 to provide dedicated services for integrating human rights considerations and values into community planning. Towards this end, CP Planning designs, launches, and stewards neighborhood, citywide, and national inclusive planning programs, bringing together nonprofit, charity, community, private, academic, and public organizations to increase the economic inclusion of racialized people and other marginalized communities in planning, development, and construction of affordable housing. Included within this is her work supporting community leaders in Little Jamaica, Toronto, to coordinate for the protection and development of affordable housing in their neighborhood, and the establishment of Partna and affordable housing developer. So warm welcome to Cheryl.
Hey, awesome. Thank you so much. So wonderful to be here. Great to see the folks here in the room and the folks online. Thank you for joining. So a little bit about me. So I started consulting in 2017, a month after receiving my undergraduate degree in urban planning. I think this is really important to note because I graduated that same year, and I was actually very dedicated towards the process of the dream that was sold to me, which is that you work hard, you get rewarded, and you buy a house. But that's not what my path was. So when I was in my undergrad, I had a 4-year strategy around what I was going to achieve every single year, so that by my 4th year, I would be in a position to get a good job. But that's again not what happened. So in my final semester, my final course, I had an assignment where we had to identify a problem and a solution to that problem and have a research study on that topic. And so that project, I really wanted to make sure that I had an impact in the real world, the external world, during my time, right? You put a lot of time into your classwork. Can that classwork also have impact in supporting folks in communities? And so that's what I did. I conducted a study and I actually reached out to someone from the public, a professional in the industry, for their advice on my implementation of that project. And in that process, I actually started to enter into the space of being a well-known expert in the topic of neighborhoods losing population and also of lack of affordable housing. I think this is really important to note that this process I took on led to me actually being published in the Toronto Star before I graduated, and I invited into podcasts. I had articles in China written about my work, but yet still I could not get a job. I sent out 100 resumes, hoping that I would be able to land something, and instead what I got was advice that, Cheryl, you're really good at writing research proposals, so how about you just pitch your projects to folks and get them funded? So this was advice that was provided to me by a senior member of the Toronto Board of Trade who really loved what I was doing, and said that this would be a better path for me rather than to just focus on getting a regular job. I didn't really understand at the time that the struggle that I had to go on for the next 5 years would actually be, in a way, a blessing, and actually a great example of what can happen when you're able to actually develop your own skill sets and your own confidence around exploring new ideas. And so, 2017, I graduated and I was able to pitch to a charity and a major consulting organization to fund my research. About $10,000 was the cost of that project. My next project was $25,000. The next project was $50,000. And then last year, I secured a funding for a project that was worth multiple millions of dollars. So again, this speaks to the fact that, if I was to actually have received a job within the planning industry as it is today, which generally speaking does not implement a culture of care, which I will speak towards in my presentation, I would not have been able to explore and to validate these ideas that human rights should be centered in our planning practices, in our process and culture of developing the physical environment. So my role in the beginning has, you can suppose to say, an instigator. That's what some folks have called me, just trying out new things and making call to the fact that, what's being discussed in the mainstream is actually not representative of what folks who are marginalized would like to see. So that report that I published right after my graduation, it was making note to the fact that most of the city of Toronto is losing population or has stagnant when you look at it over a 40-year period of time, right? 2/3 of the city is not growing. It is actually losing population or stagnant. And this contrasted very heavily from the popular discourse at the time led by the mainstream, which is that City of Toronto is growing rapidly and it's just such a boom town. It's a boom town in specific areas, right? Along transit in the downtown. The neighborhood that I grew up in Kingsley Village, actually hasn't seen any new development since the 1960s. The high school that I went to was losing classes every single year. So I wasn't able to take grade 11 and 12 French. Eventually we got rid of the band program. I was in strings in middle school, so that really didn't really affect me, but the folks who were in band were really upset. Because you imagine there's a whole community that's then built around music and these programs that is taken away because our planning program is not really there to support these communities, an immigrant community, by the way. And you can imagine then what happens when you don't have when you have schools losing population, they start to close, and then the impact of marginalization is further entrenched because a high schooler who has now to bus 20 minutes to go to school is more likely to not actually go through with fulfilling their school programming or also pursuing other dreams. So now that I've been able to spend this 5 years and proving that folks are really interested in these types of solutions, right? It was me alone full time for the first 5 years. So now I've transitioned to growing to managing a team of 10, and where my role is now to build and manage the team's capacity to carry out our mission. And so here is our mission. So our mission is to align for public, nonprofit, and private sector organizations within the land use development industry to invest in solutions that uphold the economic, social, and cultural rights of marginalized people to have access to good housing, good jobs, an adequate standard of living, and opportunities for cultural expression. So this mission is directly associated to and drawn from the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which speaks towards the fact that all humans are born equal. And so in that, we should all have access to these core resources. So I'm going to go into a discussion around a human rights framework to urban planning, which is a foundational element to the architecture, right? So human rights here, we have this diagram that I've created. In this diagram, I've drawn community as thick, right? And where human rights is centered, community has to be thick, we have to be strong. When community is strong, then we can protect each other from harm. That's what the lightning bolts represent. And in the other example is in a more individualistic society where self is prioritized, community is not as strong, and so therefore we are more susceptible to harm, right? When you look at it from the perspective of numbers, right, the human rights protects for more people to be protected from harm. So the odds that you'd be born into a position where your needs are met are greater when human rights are centered, whereas in a society that's focused on the self, the odds that you'll be born into a family where you will have your needs met and the resources to have your needs met are much less. There'll be greater poverty when we have a society based on self, and there'll be greater prosperity when we have a society that's based on human rights. What is discrimination? So discrimination is very much associated to the concept of human rights. So the idea of human rights is that we all have rights to the resources of housing, employment, culture, as I mentioned. So discrimination is acts that directly oppose the ability for folks to access those resources, and that these barriers are related to their prohibited grounds, which would include race, gender, age, etc. So here is a definition that's provided by the Ontario Human Rights Commission in the document Policy on Human Rights and Rental Housing. So we see here that there is a very clear understanding of the intersection between human rights and housing. So there are 3 types of discrimination. There's systemic discrimination, which is a lack of acknowledgement and power distributed to those desiring equitable conditions. There's indirect discrimination, which is troublesome processes to create equitable conditions. And then there is direct discrimination, which is specifying who is enabled access and who is not. So most discrimination within our spaces of planning and architecture do occur within systemic and indirect. There are instances of direct discrimination. However, you'll most see that in spaces where they are the service provider. So the service provider, for example, excluding and saying that we don't want, people, we don't, how about, I'll give you an example of this actually. If folks have been looking for housing, for example, you might see cases where someone is putting up a house to rent, but then they specify who they're looking to have rent their house. Right? That's an example of direct discrimination because it means that anybody outside of that category would not be able to access that house. And so this is actually where, as well, the issue of human rights come in, because while it is fundamental that we all have access, we all have rights and we should not be discriminated against and prevented from accessing these things, that our societies should be supporting us and removing barriers and providing resources so that we are all able to, live and thrive. The process of having your rights met can be incredibly arduous. So in order to, in this example where a landlord is saying that they only want to rent to, for example, young people, and, for example, if you're a senior in this case, the young person looking to rent and they find this apartment rentable, affordable and suitable for their interests, they're not going to go to the Ontario Human Rights Commission or tribunal to complain because it's going to take a lot of their time and resources to pursue that claim. And so they'll just end up looking elsewhere instead. So let's go into applying the framework of human rights to planning practices that shape our physical and cultural environment. So cultural practices to address systemic discrimination. So just a refresher, the definition of systemic discrimination is it is systems that lack acknowledgement and power distributed to those desiring equitable conditions. So questions to ask when you're considering whether or not the system that you're looking at is implementing systemic discrimination is to evaluate, is the historic context of marginalization acknowledged? Is this context and is discrimination and marginalization prioritized for redress? So redress is a word that comes from the realm of human rights that speaks towards if you've caused harm to somebody, then it is your role to help in their healing. So, if you've acknowledged that you've caused harm as a system that they've caused harm, are you now also then taking that next step to prioritize to support the healing of that community that you've now harmed? In evaluating if a program is implementing systemic discrimination or is a promoter of redressing for systemic discrimination, looking into if they reference marginalized groups in their research and in their work. Are they visible at all in their analysis? Are these communities part of decision-making roles? Do they actually have decision over how money is spent, how time is spent, what is important and what is not in the study? And also, are they compensated for their participation in program design? So I cannot speak about the lack of acknowledgement being a part of systemic discrimination without therefore acknowledging the instance of terra nullius and the fact that we are on stolen land. So I'm from Toronto, so this is where I know most about the culture and the history of what's happened there. And so if folks who maybe are not aware, so City of Toronto and Region of York was purchased through the Toronto Purchase, and this purchase was actually not made in good faith. So when this purchase was made, the value for taking that entire orange bit of land was the price of a couple loaves of bread. So the colonizers paid what is equivalent to the couple loaves of bread to the Indigenous peoples in exchange for the land. So this exchange was not in good faith because, in fact, the agreement was that the Indigenous communities would still be able to hunt, fish, and continue their cultural practices on the land. The sad thing is that only a couple, and of course, you've noticed if you visited Toronto that hunting and fishing is not really an accessible thing to do, especially not to maintain a whole community. And so the exchange was so terrible that just a few years after the purchase was completed, the Indigenous communities and nations wrote a letter to the Queen requesting protection because the colonizers were now letting dogs loose on the Indigenous communities to try and get them off the land. Oops. And so then you think about, in a planning study, do they ever acknowledge this history? So the way that I was able to come across and learn about this history was that in the Black Futures on Eglinton report, which is the second project that I did it on a large scale. In that study, once we completed the entire program, I wrote a report to summarize the work that had been done. And in the very beginning of the report, I put a land acknowledgement. And so in order to do an effective land acknowledgement, I made sure to do the research to really understand what am I acknowledging and how can I position this paper to support these communities. So in understanding the harm that had been done to this community, although I didn't do it in the beginning of the study, it has compelled me to be more proactive in future work to support these communities, which is why actually in the roadmap for redevelopment plans to combat systemic racism, my current major project, we have set aside budget to support and engage with Indigenous communities to ensure that the roadmap aligns with what the Indigenous communities are looking to accomplish. So Thorncrest Village. So this is a neighborhood in Etobicoke. This is really important to note because when we talk about cultural practices of care, we look at how has the system prioritized certain communities to be able to gather and have their cultural values validated. So this neighborhood was built in the 1940s and 50s. It's unique character was that at the time, it was one of the very few neighborhoods that was built to be exclusively single detached housing. Prior to this, most neighborhoods were a mix of some sort of low-rise housing of various types. And so this neighborhood was built as exclusively single detached housing, and folks had to apply to buy housing in this neighborhood. And so what was really interesting in this case is you can actually read what was submitted in their application. And so 1940s and 50s, diversity in Canada was a diversity of Europeans. So it would be Eastern Europeans, Northern Europeans, British, Italian, etc. The diversity within that European community, with a very few minorities of other cultures, right? Very different from how we are today in Toronto, which is you have folks from all across the world. And so here we talk about the idea that they wanted to escape their existing neighborhood because foreigners were starting to move in. It is not people of color as we understand it today, but it would be British people complaining about Italians living next to them. And so that's a bit of the historical context of how our neighborhoods have been established with very specific examples of Toronto. So the importance of acknowledging these histories helps to validate for people that what they're experiencing today is a result of a multitude of actions that have not aligned or supported or uplifted their humanity and their right to have their resources met, to have the resources to meet their affordable housing, employment, and cultural needs. So maintaining care requires commitment to community. So Arnstein Letter of Citizens Participation is a really great example of the level of commitment to community in terms of an approach to partnership. So I would say that most planning today that we see in the mainstream would be within the lower rungs, between 6 and 1, right? It's important to note that even in the case where you're in a system where you're placating itself might seem a bit better, right? You're going to be providing something in response to what the communities have asked for, but it's akin to providing peanuts. So an example where someone is on fire and they're saying they're being harmed, and you give them a lollipop because the lollipop will be sweet and this will make you happier. It doesn't actually respond to what they're asking for at its core. And that's a lot of what the system is today, right? We have massive affordable housing crisis, massive employment crisis, and we're getting these peanuts in response to that. So CP planning, we focus on partnership and delegation of power. So a lot of our work has been focused on the partnership, and we're just now starting to explore a delegation of power approach. So for example, in the partnership, in all of our work that we've done, we partnered with communities to implement the work and to design the work. In the first program that I did, Housing in Focus, which I applied for funding in 2017 and implemented in 2018. In that project, CP Planning partnered with about 11 organizations across the city of Toronto, and they had influence over the design of the program. So originally, when I came up with the concept, the idea was that we would collect stories about how folks believe their neighborhood would look like if housing was treated as a human right, and it was planned to reflect that, and to collect their stories into a book and present that to decision makers for them to then be so moved by their story that they would change the way that planning was done. That was my original concept. I learned about human rights in school. I wanted to put into practice what I had learned. And when I engaged with these communities, they said that they want to do more than just that. They actually want to create their own plans of what the neighborhood would look like if housing was a human right. So in that partnership, they actually shifted the entire design of the program. And so I've continued this practice of partnering with communities in the design and implementation of projects. And so in the roadmap for redevelopment plans to confront systemic racism, we're moving towards a delegated power dynamic